You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com. Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, Litecoin, and more. Cryptocurrencies and other digital assets are taking the financial world by storm. This exploding market provides everything a savvy trader needs: volatility, volume, and liquidity. Provided you know how to find it. That's where we come in. Welcome to the Crypto Rundown. Each week, we'll break down the latest trading activity, trends, and developments on everything from coins to tokens, futures, and even OTC options. If it's moving the crypto markets, then you'll find it on the Crypto Rundown. This program is brought to you by Genesis Volatility, also known as BitVol, home of institutional-grade crypto options analytics. Whether you're trading CeFi options or DeFi options, cryptocurrencies move. Use BitVol Analytics to analyze implied volatility, model realized volatility, structure positions, and unlock alpha. For more information, visit gvol.io. That's GVOL.io. Now it's time to dive into the exploding world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. It's time for the Crypto Rundown.
All right, everybody. That music means it is time once again for the Crypto Rundown, the program here on the old Options Insider Radio Network, where we go above and beyond our traditional stomping grounds of your Apples and your SPYs and your VIX options and look a little bit farther afield, see what's lighting up the tape over there in the land of the crypto. Going to talk some Bitcoin, some ETH, who knows, all sorts of fun stuff. The volume, the volatility, the skew. Going to get into a lot of that today and a whole bunch more. My name is Mark Longo from theoptionsinsider.com, as well as, of course, from the aforementioned network, reminding you there are a legion of ways for you folks to consume this content. It's unbelievable that almost 15 years in, there are still new platforms launching on the podcast side and adding our content just about every week, it seems like now. So on the on-demand front, you have no shortage of places you guys can consume the content. Of course, if you want to go above and beyond, join us live there in the Secret Club, as well as get some exclusive content, including our great pro Q&As every Tuesday and options oddities every Friday. Then theoptionsinsider.com/pro is the place to go to learn more. And of course, however you listen live after the fact, keep hitting us up, those questions, those comments, those insights, those pearls of wisdom. We do love to hear from all of you guys and gals out there. And let's see who we're hearing from today. I'm pleased to be joined once again in the old crypto hot seat by our old friend, Mr. Simon Ho, the CEO over there at T3 Index. We normally call him the Spikes father, but maybe for the purposes of this show, he'll be the BitVol father. How does that sound, Simon? Welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a while, and yep, I'm happy with either of those monikers. They sound good.
Double paternity, double fatherhood here on the show today. And we got more to add to the mix, so let's get to it. It is time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
It's time to explore the latest trending activity, trends, and developments across the world's leading crypto market. It's time for the Bitcoin Breakdown.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Bitcoin Breakdown, the portion of the show where pretty much the name says it all. We break down the week that was and indeed still is from Bitcoin trading and trending and volatility and all sorts of fun perspectives. And oh, what another fun week it has been. Net show to show, there hasn't been an enormous amount of movement. It's almost 1,000 points, so it's not nothing, but it's also in the annals of Bitcoin. It isn't the biggest net move on the week. Last week, We were right around a 62,000 level on our show. This week, we're just a little bit shy of 63,000. So it's about 1,000 points to the upside. Of course, you had a little bit wider range in between our shows. They hit just shy of the 60K level, about 59.5 on Sunday, and got up to, get this, listeners, that's where the action was, of course, nearly 67,000 out there, which is, of course, new all-time highs for Bitcoin, a level a lot of people have been hoping to see again ever since the big sell-off back in April and May. So a lot to unpack, a lot of product news to talk about, Simon. But before we get to all that fun, it's been a little bit since you've joined us here on the program. I think it's been back since the heady days of mid to early summer back in June of this year. So a lot has gone on. We have, of course, seen the aforementioned rally out there in Bitcoin. So catch us up. What's been lighting up your tape and catching your eye in the world of Bitcoin since last we chatted, sir?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. As you say, we've had this recent rally, which has been pretty promising. One of the things that has come along with this, though, which is a bit different to the last move up, is the fact that volatility levels are still around the same as they've been for a little while, for several weeks, actually. So we've got Bitcoin vol just as of a couple of days ago was about 88 vols, and in Ethereum is a 108. So those are numbers that, in other markets look pretty heady, but in our case here, this is actually fairly standard. So despite the fact that we have had a bit of a rally, which is normally associated with high volatility, in this case, it hasn't been. I just think that the strength of it hasn't really led to higher volatilities on an implied level at this point.
No, you're right. We've been crunching all those numbers there week on week, and you're right. It has been kind of hanging out. We've seen spikes. We've seen, pun intended, Simon. We've seen flurries of life out there in the vol, Bitcoin spiking over the 100 level, but it usually is fairly short-lived, and it comes right back down to somewhere in the 80-odd% range. And that's pretty much, spoiler alert, where we're hanging out right now, listeners. Coming into showtime, we are at about an 83%. That's down from where we were on our last show. By the way, of course, all these metrics and analytics we're talking about here, all these vol levels, coming at you courtesy of our friends over there at Genesis Volatility, aka GVol.io. That's the place to go to kick the tires and light the fires for all of your analytics. You want to crunch the numbers for yourself, see what's going on out there in the world of Bitcoin or ETH, from a vol, from a skew, from trading, all sorts of fun perspectives. GVol.io is the place to go. And Simon, we're going to get into a whole bunch of analytics in a second, but you're a product guy. In fact, you've got some fun new offerings to share with us today as well. I'm looking forward to getting that. But before we get there, the elephant in the room, the thing that everybody is talking about, is, of course, another new product on the Bitcoin front. On our last show, we were waiting with bated breath. We were waiting to see if the SEC was actually going to approve the new Bitcoin ETF on the CME futures. Right after showtime, pretty much that night, it got the go-ahead. So we did see the PROSHARES Bitcoin ETF, aka BITO, BITO, go live last week. It's been a fascinating run to watch. People are talking about Bitcoin. The OCC added options very quickly, within about 24 hours. That's like the fastest turnaround I've seen them have in maybe ever for a product. So clearly there was a lot of interest in this product. So now we do have options we can recommend for you here. I don't know about recommend, but you can use these options. You can now trade options in your securities account on a crypto product that is lit and listed here in the U.S. So for a lot of our U.S. listeners, that's really a big deal for a lot of you. Of course, you saw a lot of swings in the product. It rallied all the way up to almost 44, about 43.95, and then selling off to about 38.90. So quite the range over this week. Simon, I haven't had a chance to pick your brain on this, and obviously you're a product guy, so I'm very curious about your perspective. What are your thoughts on this ETF, what they had to do to get it live, the fact that they used the futures? What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Well, I think I think it's a great development for the market because obviously the interest in crypto has just skyrocketed in the last few years, and frankly, it's about time this happened. So kudos to them, to the guys at ProShares that did a good job. We also know that there are other folks out there waiting. So, for example, there's a company that we work with called TCR. They're also in line to get a Bitcoin ETF up and running as well. So certainly a lot of interest in it from the demand side, and obviously on the product side, people are stepping up to the plate. So I think it's really fantastic, and I'm hoping that this will be a bit of a gateway to seeing some of the more interesting stuff that goes on, maybe even some of the stuff that goes on in the DeFi space, which is a little bit harder for these traditional types of things to get access to. So I think overall this is a fabulous development.
And of course, a lot of people, it surprised me, their level of surprise. This seemed to me to be the easiest vector to get a product approved, was to go the futures route. But a lot of people out there were surprised at the fact that they went the futures as opposed to the quote-unquote pure play spot ETF. Obviously, a lot more regulatory hurdles involved with the latter there. I'm curious for you, were you surprised they went that route? And then we've seen a lot of other futures-oriented products out there try to replicate things and have, shall we say, less than stellar success. Things like VXX and the vol space spring to mind. What are your thoughts on the fact that they had to go to the futures? Did that surprise you? And also some of the lesser-known impacts that may have on the product going forward?
I think that this will be robust enough. I do think that, this was a big challenge, and frankly, I think that this was the only path that you could actually take. So previously, when the only CFTC regulated exchange until it wasn't was LedgerX, and that they could be a little bit more interesting in terms of the product they did. But in terms of being able to launch a product here, I really think that given the constraints that exist right now in terms of crypto participation, I think this was pretty much the only route they could have taken. And I think it's perfectly good. At the end of the day, you're trading a future which is going to track the actual cryptocurrency price very closely. So I think it's a good thing.
A lot of people were asking about the drag effect that's going to be baked into a product like this. Obviously, listeners, whenever you're trying to approximate some sort of futures position out there and then having to adjust it and roll it on a regular basis, it's going to be impacted by some sort of negative roll yield, and that's going to be some sort of drag on the product. So a lot of people were asking, is this a new VXX or something like that, something that's going to just keep eroding? What kind of a headwind is this drag going to be? We were talking about it, in fact, last week on our TWIFO program with Mr. Russell Rhodes over there. And he actually crunched the numbers for us, for a lot of our listeners who were asking this. And he tweeted it out so you could see it on his Twitter. We retweeted it as well. He said he was asked if the roll yield for Bitcoin ETFs will be the same as the issue for comparable VIX funds. He says he knows, BITO, not exactly the same beast, not managed the same way. But he said, but if it followed a consistent rolling strategy, then he thinks, looking by his, again, it's only been a week, but judging by his early numbers, he thinks the impact of the negative roll yield will be roughly 1/10 what we're seeing out there in VXX. So, Mr. Simon, it sounds like the drag obviously will still be there, but at least in the early offing, it seems like perhaps nowhere near to the degree we're seeing in comparable vol products. Does that surprise you, or is that maybe what you expected?
No, I think that's exactly what I would expect. So one here is a futures contract based on a coin, so we can think of it just as any other asset that you would normally trade. But in this case here, in the case of VXX, volatility has tremendous decay functions. So as time goes down, as we've seen over the many years that we've been watching all of those markets, is that it's usually a very steep term structure, positively sloped. So that makes it very difficult for people to actually hold long positions because you're always losing. You're falling down the curve, so to speak. So this doesn't really surprise me. I think, and I think it's a really positive thing for the market, because if you have a VXX type roll decay, it would make the product a lot less alluring for investment.
Exactly. A lot of people are going to be piling into this thing they think is going to go to the moon, and it's getting sucked down like a VXX or, God forbid, a UVXY. At least in the early offering, again, only 1 week under our belts, listeners, but in the early offering, the data at least showing not going to be anywhere near to that same degree, which again should be bullish news for all you Bitcoin bulls out there. Happy news, and maybe sadder news for people who wanted a new product to fade, like a VXX out there. But let's get to it, Mr. Simon. I know we were supposed to have you on a couple of weeks ago, a whole bunch of scheduling challenges getting you beamed in here from across the pond. By the way, Simon waking up nice and early for us here to do the show, listeners. He is from across the pond, so he gets a bonus feather in his cap. But every week on the show, we break down some of Simon's indexes that are already out there, like BitVol. On our last show last week, it was at a 90%. This week, come into today's show a little bit lighter at about an 88.75. So a little bit of a drop there in BitVol, aka the Bitcoin VIX. But we've also been quoting for the last couple of weeks here on the show Simon's newest product, which is BitSkew, which on our last show was at about a 91. So, and we talked about it before, kind of hovering. Looks like from crunching the early numbers, Simon, hovering in about a mid to high 70s, around a 77, up to about a 95 over the course of the past year. But we talk a lot about the skew of Bitcoin on this show, Simon, how it kind of swings sometimes week to week. So walk us through this. What prompted you to create this BitSkew Index, and walk us a little bit through how you decided to compile it this way?
Yeah, this is one that's a little bit left of center, I suppose. A lot of people probably don't care about this kind of stuff, but we know that there is an existing Skew Index, and a lot of people do like to look at it. And so the Skew Index, just for those that are uninitiated here, is basically, when you boil it down, it's a measure of potential risk in the underlying asset that you've got. So in this case here, we thought that we would do something that is similar to what is being done on S&P 500, for example, and on SPY, and we would do this over crypto. So the idea of the Skew Index is it tries to measure essentially what the tails of the distribution are like. And so many people are focused on that, since the huge crash of the 80s and so on. Skew trading has become, or at least understanding skew has become far more important. So in this case, there's no such thing in crypto, so we decided to create one. So we created a Skew Index for Bitcoin, and we also did one for Ethereum. So for anybody who wants to want to see the data, you can see it on our website, t3index.com, and you can see exactly what it does. So it's similar in effect to the VIX. You're looking at the tails and what the skewness of the distribution looks like, and that gives you a much better overall picture of how the underlying should behave. So what's interesting, though, with crypto is that the volatility is generally so high. We're talking about 88 and 100%, even sort of now in those two coins. It's very unlike, say, VIX, for example, where the volatility today is in the region of sort of 15, 16. So, but this is a very good barometer for people to know what the skew is like. So how steep the term structure, not the term structure, the wings and the volatility index are. So it's just a measure where we can see effectively how much risk there is in the market. Essentially, that's how you would summarize it.
And, we've seen efforts at this before. The most famous / infamous one is obviously the CBOE Skew Index. One of the big challenges of a product like this, Simon, is obviously you have two moving parts at the end of the day, right? You have the call wing and what's going on there, and you have the put wing and what's going on there. And trying to take both of those movements and condense them into one single decipherable number that people can look at and reasonably intuit as to what's going on. That's proven to be a huge challenge. So how did you tackle that, and how did you end up finding a right path that you feel to creating this kind of one-size-fits-all number that encompasses all of that movement, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on a good point. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not going to be descriptive of everything that you want to know about the particular asset. So that's not kind of the role. But really, I think it is important for people to know what the potential threat might be. So let's say you've got somebody who is new to the market, doesn't really know anything, and they want to invest in S&P 500 or something like that. Well, they're not going to know how the distribution of that particular product takes shape. And so they're going to be slightly ignorant of the facts, say, if they haven't done their homework, about the fact that in equity volatility, typically you'll find that the moves down are much greater and much faster, but far less frequent. So that is effectively what we're trying to do here. Create an indicator for people in the crypto space that's analogous to what we see on the volatility space for equities, and give them that information to help them help them with their trading, and also, the more you know about the underlying distribution and what those prices mean and how they reflect, the better you're going to be positioned to take action in the market. So that's really what it is. It's having a skew index. This maybe it's not for all, but certainly it does give you some indications as to the steepness of the term structure, not the term structure, sorry, the steepness of the skew in options prices.
Like I mentioned, we've been kind of talking about it for the last few weeks since you launched it over there at T3. It was at a 91 last week, close to that this week, about a 90.6 right now. It seems to have hovered in the range of about 77 to about 95 over the past year. Would you say that range is kind of indicative of the range of the product? And would you also say maybe when you start getting into levels like we're seeing right now, somewhere in the 90s range, or perhaps on the other side down into the 70s, that's where really you might want to start paying attention? That's where things are happening, Simon, out there from a skew perspective?
Yeah, I think so, yes. And I also think that what's happened is that the volatility has come down, as we mentioned at the top of the show. Just in general, volatility has come down. And so by definition, normally that comes hand in glove with a slightly lower skew index as well, obviously. So the more volatile it is, obviously the skew index will rally, and likewise, if there's less volatility, then the skew index should go down. So just another metric for people to look at to help situate themselves in terms of the trades that they want to put on. And we thought it would be somewhat useful, given that the original skew index is fairly well viewed.
What's interesting about your index versus the SIBO index is when the SIBO index, like let's say recently in the last couple of weeks, it got up to the 150s level, which is, that's typically pretty high for that index. And usually that's a result of crazy high premium being built into the put wing. People are looking to hedge. And that's typically what you see out there in the broad equity indices. Crypto, a little bit of a different beast. Obviously, a lot of times the crazy skew and the crazy bids that we're seeing is to the call wing instead. Would you say that's kind of what's driving a lot of the upside we've seen of late, Simon? A little bit of reverse action is when the calls get crazy heavy, that's when your skew index starts to rally a bit?
Yeah, actually, you've hit on a very good point that I should have raised earlier, and that is that when you look at the skew index for equities, clearly that's biased to the downside because the market tends to rally slowly, and whenever there's something that happens that's bad, it collapses. Whereas in crypto, that doesn't happen because it's actually kind of bifurcated. It can be volatile up and it can be volatile down. So that's another reason why we decided that this might be a useful index for people to look at, because the behavior of crypto is rather different than regular equities. So yeah, I definitely think it has a place because, there's nothing else that's out there at the moment, certainly, that is comparable and can give investors the insight that they need in this particular dimension.
Not certainly in this kind of one condensed number, which I like. So you got quite the offering over there at T3 now. You got BitVol, which is kind of the Bitcoin VIX. We talk about it every week here on the show. We've got this newest edition, which is BitSkew. So it sounds like, Simon, people come to T3 Index these days. You get kind of a nice 1-2 punch from an overall crypto vol perspective, Simon.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, we have recently made some additions to the website too to make things a little bit easier for people. So if people go in there and they want to look at the BitVol and the ETHVol, for example, you can toggle between both of those at the top there. So then you can actually compare the two fairly similarly. We also show recent tick data. So we'll show the tick data for the last 24 hours or so you can see exactly how it's involved. And below that, you have, as you mentioned, we do trade BitVol in an OTC context at the moment, and we have the BitVol options prices in here as well. So that's a pretty cool barometer, and it's updated twice a day, and they're tradable prices.
Yeah, I mean, when you last came on, you were seeing some OTC prints in BitVol. How's that going? Have you seen any more of that since the last time we chatted, Simon?
Yeah, there's been a couple of little trades. Obviously, we would ultimately, if anybody is listening to this and are interested, we're looking for a home on an exchange. I think that would obviously multiply the amount of volume that we could do here. But yes, we have been doing it OTC. There are people like pension funds, for example, getting involved, and dedicated crypto firms as well. So it's not huge volume, but there is volume, and there are prices out there every day. If anybody's interested, they can just drop on the website and take a look at the pricing.
We're going to take some more looks at Simon's offerings in a second. Let's keep on rolling now here with all of this data. We got a crunch here for the show, all the activity going on. Well, let's break down what's going on from an OI perspective here on the Bitcoin options front. And overall, not the biggest of weeks. I mean, we saw a little bit of range out there and certainly new highs. I think that might draw some more people in. Yet the calls on Bitcoin, again, this is on Deribit. This is the big dog. At about 141,000 contracts open right now. It's only up about 3,000 from last week. And the puts are about 66,000, only up about 1,000. Still at that roughly a little more than 2 now to 1 level out there. Calls over puts, again, kind of reflecting what Simon was just talking about with his Skew Index, the action, the concern, the volume, call it what you will. The OI still heavily concentrated to the upside versus the downside. Speaking of where your positions are concentrated, let's look where you guys are lining up from an expiration perspective right now. Coming into showtime, it's still the quarterlies that are leading the dance out there. December, number 1 with about 83,000 contracts, up about 5,000. Again, not huge changes this week. Number 2 is October, but a distant number 2, only 51,000. It's up about 6,000 contracts from last week. Does not seem like October is going to have time to catch December before it rolls off the board next week. And the number 3 right behind it is November, again, with a distant number 3, 25,000 contracts there. So that has a ways to go as well. In terms of the notional value, really, of that OI, how much actual notional value is there? You know, I'm not the biggest fan of measuring things from a notional perspective. That's the crypto way, so I will go with the flow. On Deribit last week, there was about 12 billion worth of notional value and about a little over 13, about 13 and a quarter if you add up all the rest of the venues, you know, your Ledger X's and CMEs and everything else. On this week, it's about the same. Again, we didn't see a net huge swing in the underlying net show to show, and we didn't see huge increases in OI really, so it's not surprising that it is about the same. Even though we did have a pretty active week from a volume perspective. Remember last week we saw what might have been the busiest day ever from a notional volume perspective on Deribit, over 3 billion, about 3.3 billion, as I recall, out there on the 15th. Didn't quite see that this week, but we were back up over the 1 billion level, and they maintained that for pretty much the entirety of the week. 1.2 billion on the 19th, 1.3 billion on the 20th, 1.4 billion on the 21st, and 1.2 billion again on the 22nd. So you had multiple days north of 1 billion, which again, you go back to the last time Simon joined us in June, it was probably a couple of 100 million on the tape those days. So that's a far cry from what we were putting up back in this summer. And again, goes to show that when Bitcoin's at these frothier levels, it does tend to drive a little bit more action out there. Let's see how that action is shaping up. What are the size positions that are open right now in Bitcoin options? Where are the strikes where you folks are really piling in? And it, once again, it maintains. Actually, I take it back. It's not maintaining. It is now tied because it has been the number 1 strike for a while out there in Bitcoin. Of course, and talk about the par strike, the 100,000 strike. This week, it has a new rival. The 70,000 strike is now tied. So we have a tie, a first tie in a while for the number 1 spot out here in terms of the size positions of Bitcoin options, because both the 70,000 strike and the 100,000 strike have about exactly 16,000 contracts open. So they are slugging it out for the number 1 spot. Something, finally, to potentially usurp the 100K strike out there where you folks have just been glued for the better part of the last few months. Number 2/3, I guess, depends how you view as the tie for number 1, is the 80,000 strike with about 12,000 contracts. It's up about 2,000 from last week, but still a distant number 2, or 3 in this case. Number 4 here, got the 120 strike. So if the 100,000 strike's not enough for you, got the 120 strike. It's at about 9,800 contracts open. It's up only about 600 from last week. It's not a big change there. And number 5 is the 60K strike, which again is now effectively the at the money strike out there. That's at about 9,400 contracts. That's down actually about 2,600 from this time last week. Of course, transitioning over to the CME front, obviously a lot of eyes were turned towards them this week with the launch of the BITO product, which of course was trading the futures. As a result, we talked about it on TWIFO last week. Huge numbers in the options as well. The options did over 500 contracts last week, which again, doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about the options that could some weeks do 80 contracts, that's actually a ton. Of course, it's a 5X contract as well. So you're talking a lot of actual coins going up out there last week. The OI also increasing nearly 300 contracts to 1,420. I'm pretty sure that's a new all-time high out there for the options. So this new PROSHARES ETF is driving a lot of paper. In fact, Simon, it might be driving too much paper. The futures were printing a lot of numbers last week, 14,000 contracts again on Friday. The OI is skyrocketing. It's up to over 17,000. It's up about 5,500 contracts in this time last week. A lot of that obviously driven by just the frenzy around this BITO product. In fact, this BITO ETF has been so popular, Simon, that they're already talking about bumping up against position limits on the CME. CME limits you to 4,000 contracts in the front future, and they actually dropped that to 2,000 3 days before expiration. And obviously, as this ETF has proven popular, they're going to need a lot more than that. Of course, each of those 5X contracts, so they're limiting you to about 20,000 coins worth of exposure on this product. So ProShares is already talking about potentially changing their allocations, moving not just in the front month, but kind of doing what USO had to do back when the crazy days of oil, and spreading that exposure out, maybe half in October, half in November, and then probably going farther down the curve, I would imagine. They've also talked about, and they actually have it in their prospectus, something to be aware of, listeners, picking up not just the futures, but also investing in equities with crypto exposure. So the more popular this thing gets, just be aware the tracking could potentially become a bit of an issue as they move farther out the exposure curve. And also they start investing in things that aren't straight one-to-one futures anymore. These are effectively now going to be equities with who knows what kind of correlation they have to crypto. So Simon, you're a product guy. Does it surprise you that they'd be bumping into these limits so soon? And what are your thoughts on their proposed remedies here, moving down the futures curve and also perhaps going outside the futures into equities with quote-unquote crypto exposures? What impact is that going to have on the product over the long term, sir?
Yeah, well, I think that could be problematic. I mean, as you mentioned just then, very adroitly, that you're going to introduce tracking error if you do things like that. So I think the two proposals from what you said was, to have different months. So those are going to perform slightly differently as well, and they're going to have different actual levels. So similar to what we spoke about earlier, but obviously a lot less with the VXX and stuff like that. But when you get into the equity space, yeah, I think that's not a good thing. However, I mean, this is all brand new here, and I'm sure that as there's more popularity, that the exchange is going to allow for bigger open interest limits and so on. So I think it will sort itself out pretty rapidly, especially if there's a lot of demand for it. But as it stands, you're right; those two are fairly negative for it, I think. But like I said, I think it's probably going to be transient.
Yeah, and I have a feeling the folks at CME might be a little bit more lenient with this one too. This is the first real big hit they've had in the crypto space. It's obviously driving a lot of paper. I have a feeling they're going to be willing to work with ProShares to find a level that makes sense, because you start changing the way this product is structured, you have a very different product at the end of the day. Again, I refer you to USO, pre and post inversion in WTI, a very different product coming out of it than it was going in. Obviously, the micro futures, everything across the board at CME has been put up a lot of numbers this past week. The OI and the micro futures is up about 5,000 almost to 63,500. Putting up another about 27,000 contracts just on last Friday. So we're seeing big numbers across the board out there in CME. Again, no surprise. In fact, maybe too big if these position limit numbers are going to hold true. So we'll pay attention to that as well, what they're going to do on the position limit front going forward as we keep going forward right on into the altcoin universe.
It's time to move beyond Bitcoin and find out what's moving the rest of the crypto marketplace. It's time to boldly venture into the altcoin universe.
All right, listeners, we can probably talk BITO and BitSkew and all that good stuff for the rest of the show, but there's other products out there to sink our teeth into as well. Starting here in the altcoin universe, where we explore just about everything else out there, including our foray here into the top 10. Let's see what's going on out there from an overall market cap perspective. Number 10 on our list this week, good old USD coin, holding at right around 37.8 billion. Number 9 is Doge, still hanging out in the top 10 this week at about 34.5 billion. Number 8, POLKADOT, 43.7 billion. Number 7, XRP, also still hanging out in the top 10 this week at about 51.3 billion. Number 8, Solana, over 200 now, 212. So just quite the run that Solana has been on out there of late at about 63, almost 64 billion. Number 5, it's Tether at about 69, just a hair under 70 billion. Number 4, Cardano at about 71 billion out there. Number 3, Binance Coin at about 80, almost 81 billion. You know what number 2 and number 1 are. Number 2 is ETH, just shy of half, just shy of half a trillion, 496 billion. Man, we're getting up there in ETH land. And Bitcoin at that's where the price level is, 63,000. And 1.1, almost 1.2 billion from a market cap perspective. Are we going to get to the much ballyhooed flippening there with ETH and Bitcoin sometime in the not too distant future? I know a lot of ETH heads would love that. ETH having an interesting week out there. Decent rally, all things considered, up about 450 handles from this time last week. Last week we were hovering around 3,750 coming into today's show, just a hair shy of 4,200 out there. We saw a nice high of almost 4,400 this week, about 4,370, and a low of about 3,750. So quite the that was pretty much on our last show. That was the low. So quite the run for ETH over the course of the past week. Vol-wise, something similar to what we're seeing in Bitcoin, not from a level perspective, but just kind of the hanging out perspective. We had a 99 last week, down to about a 97 this week. Still elevated, but not a big movement on the week. Skew-wise out here as well. Last show was about a big change in ETH skew, which is kind of interesting. Last show was about a 2.5. This week, come into this week, 9.2. Mr. Simon, I know you have the ETH vol out there, and you're cranking away on all these skew numbers. What are your thoughts on the ever-evolving skew in ETH, sir?
Yeah, I must say, that's a little bit more esoteric for me. This is all sort of, we're relatively new to the whole crypto space. So Ethereum, I must say, is a bit of an enigma for me at the moment. I'm not really sure, but it's consistent in terms of its behavior relative to its cousin, Bitcoin. So, and it also continues, it essentially is always more volatile. So those properties have been around since I started looking at it. So not much change in the relative positions between those two assets.
No plans for an ETH skew anytime in the near. I know you have ETH vol, no ETH skew coming.
No, I think. Depends if there's demand, but obviously we have one index out there. It's fairly easy for us to cut and paste and do the second one, but we'll just have to see if there's genuine interest in it. Absolutely, we would do it.
Well, given what our audience likes, they love to talk themselves some ETH and some ETH skew, sir. So you may be turning on the old ETH skew machine perhaps sooner than you thought out there. Looking at the overall OI, we could see a similar structure in terms of the action is still call heavy in ETH, just like it is in Bitcoin. ETH OI crossing the 1 million level for the calls this week, just north of 1 million right now. That's up 84,000 contracts from this time last week. So a lot of call action in ETH this week. The puts also up, but a lot less. The puts are up to about 421,000. It's up exactly 21,000. It was 400K last week. So still well north of pretty much 2.5 to 1 calls over puts out there, which is a similar structure to what we're seeing in Bitcoin right now. Going to take probably another pronounced sell-off to really get a lot of action going in those puts. So, but we'll see. Time will tell out there. In terms of the notional value of that ETH is rallying. So, and we are seeing more options piling in. So not surprising that would tick up on Deribit. It was about 5 billion last week. This week, about 6 billion. A pretty active week on Deribit as well. Again, not blowing the doors off, but decent numbers out there. 632 million with a notional changing hands on the 20th. That was the busiest day. And about 541 million on the 21st. Again, no 1 billion days, which we have seen in the past, but pretty active nonetheless. And where is that action lining up? Where are you folks trading in ETH options right now? It's mostly been all quarterlies all the time, and that's pretty much the case with one exception this week. DECE is still the big dog with 542,000 contracts. That's up about 29,000 from this time last week. October catching up, but still a long way to go. 275,000 contracts open in October. That's up 40,000 from this time last week. And March up to about a little north of 250,000, 256,000. That's up 49,000 from this time last week. So a lot more positioning, a lot more OI going up in these months. Given the numbers we just saw, it's mostly calls. And looks like March is closing in. It's got a bit of a ways to go to catch up to DECE, but looks like it's going to maybe even usurp October by the time October goes away. In terms of where you guys are lining up from a strike perspective, what are the size positions in ETH options right now? If you set the 5,000 strike, you would still be the winner chicken dinner. That's kind of been on top of our list for a while. 108,000 contracts open there. It's up about another 12,000 this week. So as we get closer to the 5,000 strike in real life, more OI piling in to that strike in the options. That makes a lot of sense. Number 2 is the ever optimistic 10,000 strike with about 81,000 contracts. It's up 13,000. So both the 5K and the 10K strike adding a lot of paper this week. Number 3, the 15,000 strike. So if 10K doesn't do it for you, 15K with 75,000 contracts open. That's up 20,000 from this time last. That's our biggest increase, our biggest change in the top 5 is the 15,000 strike. So interesting things afoot on the higher levels of the call wing here in ETH. Number 4, the comparatively reasonable 6,000 strike. That's got about 65,000 contracts open. That's up about 13,000 as well. So a lot of positioning there. Number 5 is the 4,000 strike with 56K. That's pretty much unched from this time last week out there. So top 3, 5,000, 10,000, and 15,000 strikes, just showing you where the action, where the interest is out there in ETH. ETH futures also putting up some numbers over there at CME. Seems like everything CME got a nice shot in the arm last week with the launch of that ETF, because the ETH futures did 7,000 contracts last week and just on Friday. And the OI is up to 5,000. That's up 1,000 from this time last week. So that's a huge increase in the interest in ETH. Maybe some of the rumblings we're hearing are the reason for that. We'll get to that a little bit later in your crypto question segment. Let's run down a few others. And then, Simon, I know you always have some altcoin you're following. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well. Interesting weeks out there for Ripple. Again, up about a penny, but still holding firm in the top 10 out there. Good old DOGECOIN up 0.7 of a cent, I should say, out there, but not quite. So almost up a penny, but not quite. But still, again, holding firm in the top 10 this week. Litecoin having a nice little pop again, up 10, almost 11 handles from this time last week. It does seem like that pump and dump scam from a couple of weeks ago kind of lit a new fire under Litecoin out there. People rediscovering it that maybe had moved away from it. Some other cryptos that are lighting up off this week, obviously Cardano up about 4 cents. It's been holding firm at a little bit north of $2 for a while out there. Polkadot up about 3 3/4, and Solana, like I said, 55. I had a bid. I was working lower in there. It bounced way away from that, so I think I missed it. I'll have to go check. But I certainly wasn't bidding over 200 for it, and that's where it is this week. Up 55 handles. This Solana run has been crazy. I'm curious, Simon, I know you like to watch a lot of altcoin. I know you've been interested in ETH in the past as well. Any of these other altcoin out there these days kind of catching your eye? Maybe a Solana or maybe something else that's not even in our top 10 that's kind of been on your radar, Mr. Simon?
Not specifically. So I don't focus on the things that aren't sort of the major coins, just because, you know, I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool crypto person. I mean, I love it, but I just don't know as much about it because, you know, my regular day job is other stuff. So I don't think I can sort of comment a lot about that. But yeah, it is amazing. I mean, you've just gone through all of the volume numbers. I mean, as you said, we haven't spoken since June. It's just phenomenal how much growth there is in this. And so I think it's really positive. And the fact that the ETF has gone up this week is just stellar. I mean, you've already seen, and you've been talking about the OI in the futures. That's going to go way, way higher, I think.
Has this lured you to the dark side between the BitVol and the BitSkew? Have you started slinging a little crypto in your old accounts? Maybe even some of the options on BITO, Simon? Any crypto trading in your own portfolio right now?
A little bit here and there, yes. So I would still say that I'm a novice in terms of the actual investing in it, but it's very alluring. And I mean, it's just so popular. And another thing that caught my eye really has been the DeFi stuff. I mean, some of the things that go on there are just unbelievable, and they're awesome. And it's really quite eye-opening. I wasn't, you know, as I said, I'm fairly a newcomer to this particular space, but there's a plethora of really interesting things going on.
Any particular DeFi projects, I should say, that are catching your eye right now, sir?
Yeah, I think so. And also, I mean, you talk about, are we in particular coins? No, but what we are interested in is we've created a methodology for an ETF that takes like sort of the top 10 coins, and we've got a very unique way of sort of putting that portfolio together. So that's kind of what I'm focused on at the moment, trying to launch an ETF that has a bunch of the most active coins in the portfolio. And we've got as I said, a very unique way of sort of putting that together, which I think is pretty interesting.
I love it. The T3 ETF. So you're going to join the list of about 7,000 ETF applications that are out there right now with the SEC. So I think we probably have our own somewhere here at Options Insider. Everyone seems to have filed one, but I'm curious to see yours come to fruition as well, Simon, because, hey, the more products out there, the merrier. As we keep on rolling, speaking of the more, the merrier, that also applies to your questions. So let's get to them.
You've got questions about crypto. Who doesn't? It's time to find out the answers to your crypto questions.
All right, everybody, welcome to the Crypto Questions. Before we get to your queries really quickly, if you remember on our last episode, listeners, we had Eric from Vellum Capital, and we were still waiting to see if this ETF was going to be approved. So we put a little flash poll out during the episode. We just asked you very simply, do you plan to trade this new ETF if it's approved? And yes or no, or you're not sure. And it was surprising. You guys came in exactly split, 45.5% for yes and no, and then 9.1% of you taking the safety valve out of, you're not sure yet. And then we thought once it got listed later in the week, we would run that same poll again. I think we did it during our TWIFO program. Another flash poll. We asked you a similar question, but we said now that it's live and has your opinion changed, do you think you're going to trade this thing, yes or no? And this time the no's took it. 55.6%, only 44.4% for yes. So that kind of surprised me given the volume and upswing and interest we've seen in this thing. So Simon, are you surprised as I was that our audience, who is admittedly a very savvy bunch, that they're a little bit more, maybe they were waiting for these drag numbers to come in before they dove in, Simon, because they are a very savvy bunch.
Well, I mean, if they're your listeners, they're bound to be savvy bunch. So no, it doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I guess all the fanfare around the ETF wasn't blowing your skirts up. You weren't too excited about this. We'll see. Again, now we have some drag numbers. Now we have some volume numbers. We'll see what's going on with the position limits next week when we're talking about this thing. If those position limits don't change, this could be a very different product. So again, fascinating stuff. Speaking of the ETF, again, the inevitable question coming in this time from Eric. Eric wants to know, do you think a pure play ETF is next on the horizon from the SEC? No. We talked about this last week on the show. There are a ton. Just look at the crazy price action we saw in Bitcoin last week on the spot venues, for an example. Bitcoin, someone tried to sell 500 plus Bitcoin last week, and they ended up crushing it all the way down to, I think, around 8,200 was where the last fill was. So some lucky sucker out there who had some stub quotes to buy Bitcoin at much lower prices got filled all the way down sub 10,000. And on the flip side of that, some poor fund or something else who made a fat finger error, maybe they went to market when they shouldn't have, whatever the case may be, they got crushed. They got annihilated on their 500 odd coins. Of course, the nature of the space being what it is, I mean, if that was a traditional product, you could adjust that or maybe bust that trade. Crypto, not so much. That's one of the issues out there with making this a very viable trading product. Stuff like that happens, you have to have some sort of recourse. And unfortunately right now in crypto, there is not. But that's a conversation for another day. People are asking about the ETF. That kind of spot issue, certainly seems like Gensler and the SEC are still very reticent to approve anything until they have a lot more insight into the spot space. In fact, saw an interesting piece. I think it was on MarketWatch. They interviewed a former SEC official. And he thinks, and I can kind of get behind this as well, he thinks the next big ETF play is going to be on the ETH futures front. And that makes a lot of sense. The CME product, again, I mean, the ETH futures are still pretty nascent. They have to do some more volume, I think, before we can really talk about lighting it up with an ETF out there. But this official they interviewed says thinks there's a lot more work to be done by the firms to design products that provide investor protection and market integrity assurance before we see a green light on the spot ETF. But he thinks the ETH futures traded at CME might be more foreseeable in the near future than a spot ETF because it's the futures. So it follows the same path that made the SEC comfortable with the Bitcoin futures. So again, it's a well-trodden path. The SEC has already approved the big Bitcoin futures. It's the exact same methodology for the ETH ones. Again, the volume's a little bit lighter, but I could certainly see perhaps the ETH future ETF coming to light before we see, I think the spot one, I think, unfortunately, is still a ways off. Simon, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts, first off, on the prospects for the quote-unquote spot or the pure play ETF? Do you think it's in the near future? Or do you think it's pretty much a ways off as well? And then what do you think about this SEC official suggesting maybe we'll see the ETH ETF next before we see the spot product?
Yeah, I agree with you on both of those points. I think that it's going to be very hard work, very uphill for people to be able to get the spot contract up and running. That's tied into the whole concept of these sorts of coins around the world. And so I think that will be the last thing to come. I think it's a long way off, frankly. But I do think, so to answer your question, yes, I think that the ETH version of this futures contract will come around a lot sooner than you're going to be able to get the spot contract. I see that as a long way off. There has to be a whole regime change, I think, before people would allow it.
Yeah, not the news I know a lot of our Bitcoin ETF bulls want to hear, but unfortunately, that's the regulatory scene here in the U.S. right now. They are still obviously, and with good reason, questioning what's going on out there on the spot side. There's a lot of, shall we say, dubious activity, and also it's still very much the Wild West, and they're not going to dive in and approve a product before they have a lot more insight into that space. So be happy we got the future. That's going to hopefully ease some concerns out there. It allows you to have something you can put in your securities account, which is what a lot of you wanted. It's approved for trading here in the U.S., which I know a lot of you wanted. And also, it's got options on it extremely quickly. So that's another thing a lot of our U.S. audience wanted. So in the meantime, again, it's got some of those drag and other issues we talked about. But in the meantime, this is certainly not a terrible alternative for you to check out over there at CME. Again, this product could change very much in the near future, so it's still very much a wait and see how the evolution that goes on with these term limits and everything else. But an intriguing first step, that's for sure. And speaking of intriguing first steps, Simon, you guys have taken many of them now on the crypto vol front. You kind of created what is now the Bitcoin VIX with BitVol. You got ETHVol, and now you've got BitSkew. So all sorts of exciting stuff. If folks want to check out all of that, where should they go? What should they do, sir?
Oh, thank you. So we have a website, t3index.com. It's got a whole bunch of information in there on all of the indices that Mark just referenced. And, of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We're open to new ideas, and we enjoy creating sort of new products that are going to be useful for people. So, yeah, please reach out.
I know you're always cooking up some cool stuff in your little mad laboratory over there. So before we go, Simon, let's leave them wanting more. Give our audience maybe some hints, some peeks behind the curtain. What can they expect from you guys coming down the road at T3, sir?
Approximate thing for us is the reference that I made to getting an ETF. Obviously, in the US, this is going to be difficult, so we may have to list that somewhere else. But what's really interesting about this particular thing is the way that it's been created. And it's true to say that in actuality that no one's created a portfolio the way that we have, because it actually came from an American linguist who lived about 100 years ago and created this thing called a Zipfian distribution. As it turns out, this particular distribution is awesome for putting an ETF together. And as it happens, when we've done our testing, crypto in particular. So that's something that we're excited about and that we're focused on at the moment. And of course, we're looking for a partner on the exchange side so that we can get the BitVol and ETHVol contracts listed on an exchange and have that alongside the OTC product as well.
See, you've always got a surprise up your sleeve. I did not expect you to go into century-old linguistics there, sir. But there we go. Surprises from Simon. Check them out for yourselves. Everything they got cooking, BitVol, BitSkew, ETHVol, and a whole bunch more over there. T3index.com is the place to go. You know where to go to kick the tires and light the fires for all of the crypto volatility analysis and analytics and everything else we're talking about here on the show. The skew, the OI changes, all that good stuff. gvol.io is the place to go. We got to go on out of here, but don't worry. Got a lot more great content coming at you throughout the week. Got a great pro Q&A session for our secret club members tomorrow. Also have the advisor's option coming in for its monthly appearance tomorrow on the network, of course, later on this week. For all of you out there who may be a little bit confused by all these terms we're throwing around out here, Education Wednesday is there for you with Options Bootcamp, Options Playbook Radio. Thursday, of course, TWIFO, This Week in Futures Options, a show a lot of you listening to this show should be listening to because we talk a lot about crypto on that show. Of course, episode 2 of the Option Block. Friday, Volatility Views, which I do believe Mr. Simon's going to be waking up early to join us on Double Dose of Simon this week. I'm looking forward to that. Followed after that, of course, for all of you Secret Club members, by Options Oddities. And we're back again next Monday, another episode of the Crypto Rundown. We'll see you then.
This program is brought to you by Genesis Volatility, also known as GVol, home of institutional-grade crypto options analytics. Whether you're trading CeFi options or DeFi options, cryptocurrencies move. Use GVol Analytics to analyze implied volatility, model realized volatility, structure positions, and unlock alpha. For more information, visit gvol.io. That's GVOL.io. You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.